Hello, my name is Roman Blagovirnyy, and I'm one of the 3 user experience designers who actually worked on this project. And before I dive into the specifics, I want to talk about the user experience design and how it applied to this project, and kind of walk you through some of the steps that we did when we worked to develop a user experience for our Blue Angels website. So, what is user experience design? And, why do we engage in this practice, and what are some of the benefits of doing user experience design? Some define the user experience design as a practice that of creation of architecture and interaction models that affect all aspects of user experience. And the scope of this practice is directed at defining how the user interacts with the product, how the user learns the product, and how the product is perceived. But I also think that it goes a little bit further than that, because user experience designers nowadays also dive into things like visual design, research, and so on. And I think one of the important things that I should mention is that user experience design, or user experience rather, is subjective. So you can't really design a user experience, but you can try to design for a certain user experience. It is also important to realize that user experience design is a pretty involved process with many steps, and I won't go through each one of these in detail, but I will touch on some of these as they're related to our project a little bit later down the road. And the bulk of the user experience design actually happens at the start of the project, but continues throughout the entire project, the entire duration of the project. And you might ask yourself, why do we hire user experience designers? Why do we do user experience design? And there are a number of reasons why we do this. Some of this is to obvious things like improve usability and user adoption, but user experience designers also help to develop a certain set of guidelines that expedite development and ensure that the products that we produce meet the end goals and for our clients. At the beginning of our project, we had a chance to sit down with the folks there and ask them a few questions, because we really wanted to learn what are some of the considerations and requirements that would affect the user experience and the website. And the questions that we got to ask them, were many, but things like, what is the objective of the site? And I think Cindy mentioned this a little bit before. And, the site serves to inform and educate the public about the Blue Angels mission. It also helps to assist in the recruitment efforts for the Navy and the Marines, and help generate public interest in the Blue Angels. And our goal is to produce the website that meets all of these goals. Some other questions that we asked were about the audience. Who is the audience? Who are we designing for? And we were actually able to identify several key types of audience members. People like the aviation enthusiasts, the parents, the biggest fan, even Navy and Marines. And what we learned here is that people, our audience is pretty diverse, and they go to this website for different reasons. And they all have various backgrounds and various technical abilities, but all of these people want to be wowed when they go to our website. And for those who are already familiar with the Blue Angels, they want to feel that connection and that sort of visceral, almost experience that they have when they see the Blue Angels perform at an air show. So we wanted to kind of recreate that or reference that in our website. Also, a lot of requirements and considerations would also affect the user experience in the end. And these are things like the Blue Angels identity is very important to the organization. It's kind of their emblem. It's what people recognize them by. the contents of the site. What is the content that we had to account for? The new content, the old content. How are we going to fit this into our site structure? The accuracy of presentation and information, very critical because we don't want to be misleading. And also social media integration. The Blue Angels want to feel, or they want fans to feel connected with them and receive the various updates, so that will also come into play here. The platform technology requirements, critical, because this will define what we can and kind of can't do with our end experience. And support for all the browsers, 508, and then a little bit later. Also, not the least bit important, budgets and timelines. So taking all of that, the objectives, the audience, and requirements will help us define our user experience design approach to our user experience. And what we realized here is that we can't actually reproduce the Blue Angels experience online, and we're not going to try to do this, but what we're going to try to do is augment this user experience through the technology that we have on our hands, and we're going to leverage the platform in new ways for users to experience the Blue Angels and feel that connection with the Blue Angels as an organization. And once we got all that information, we also had enough kind of ideas swimming in our heads to start thinking about the format of this thing. What is it going to look like in the end? Is it going to be a rich internet application? Is it going to be something else? And at this point, it seemed like the rich internet application approach would be the best, because it would allow us to create an experience that will meet all of our goals and enable us to deliver very rich presentation of this information. However, this is this is an uninformed decision at this point, and we'll kind of re-evaluate this a little bit down the road as we talk with our client, as we talk with the developers. So once we had all that information and we got back to Rochester, we were ready to start working on the site. And where do you start with when you're designing for something like this? And usually, or sometimes the first step is to start designing the information architecture for your site. And this step, in the step, we seek to define kind of the information buckets and the information grouping, and help outline the user experience at a high level. And this will also help us to define the scope of the project from a design perspective. So we began this process by creating the nodes, or in other words, grouping the information into buckets, logical buckets, nodes that would represent unique views in our application. And the objective here is to kind of group the information in logical ways. And the organization of these nodes will help to define the navigation pathways through the site or the rich internet application. And on our first attempt, we were able to kind of group the information into seven high-level nodes. You can see them here. So moving forward, we will evaluate this and we'll seek to kind of expand on these nodes and kind of outline more information about each one of these things, and also reevaluate, is this the correct group of information? Can we reduce this? Are there any redundancies? Do we need more nodes, for example? Does this information grouping help us present all of our content in a logical and structured way? And you can see some of the next steps, we're starting to define a little bit the nodes themselves, kind of what is the user going to see when they come to this node. And these features are outlined here at a high level, and the result of this usually comes out of brainstorming sessions and things like this. So we're looking, when we're defining this, we're looking for ideas that will help us deliver rich and engaging experiences to the user. As we move forward, we begin to structure these nodes in an organization that makes a little bit more sense. And you can see some of the navigation pathways taking shape and some of these features appearing, and these are some refinements. And this is the final information architecture that we arrived at. You can see that we actually reduced some of the high-level nodes and we deepened the information structure. So after reviewing this with the client and the development team, I think we were pretty happy at this point because we realized that this information architecture will help us cover most of our content, or at least the most important content for this website. But, taking this, we were now ready to proceed and kind of flesh out some of those nodes in greater detail, which leads us to the preliminary node architecture and wireframe workflows. And this is a critical step because it will help us define the user interactions and the node functionality, and it will help us to show the state changes and kind of show us what the user will experience in each one of the nodes. And the final deliverable in the stage will be a set of documents of wireframes that will define all these aspects and also serve as a spec for the developers. So the developers can actually take this document and start building prototypes and kind of laying out the basic functionality for the site. But it's important when you're starting this exercise to think about your approach a little bit. And we did just that, and we identified some of the principles that will help us govern the wireframes of workflows that we designed. So content centricity, content as an interface, kind of relates to the point about taking the content and making it the most important thing in your website, not trying to obscure it through some crazy interactions and giving the user quick access to this content, because content is really the most important thing here. We're trying to be content focused. But we also want to design for compelling interactions, which means that when the users come to the site to interact with the content, they want to be wowed, and the interactions are very engaging and keep the user focused and interested in using the site. But keeping that in mind, we of course want to make the site usable for almost everyone, but I'm not saying everyone because that will require us to compromise on a lot of our user experience, but we can address maybe 98% of the cases through things like graceful degradation and backwards compatibility. And we also want to be conscious about the client's maintenance needs for this site because they have to update the content. And it's also critical to have a clear understanding of some of the constraints that would limit the user experience or kind of shape this in a way. We had several of those. For example, we had a pretty aggressive timeline. We also had some logistic challenges. As Cindy has mentioned, we had a lot of content to wrap our minds around. We also had 3 designers working on this project at one time. So how do you manage that work? And also the technical feasibility, which kind of relates to the platform that we're going to use, what we can and can't do. And the developers actually had a lot of input on this. So keeping all that in mind, we were now ready to create the interaction model for the site. And for those of you who are not familiar, the interaction model will describe how the user interacts with the website and how they will navigate within this application. And here's one of the pages from this interaction model document. And this is a kind of very high-level schematic, and the purpose of this document is to give the developers and the client an understanding of how the user will navigate this content and how the user will interact with this content. But we're not defining specific controls here or specific mechanisms at a very low level. We're keeping it high level. So if I zoom in here, you can see that the top portion of the screen shows us how the user will navigate across the nodes, and the lower portion of the screen shows us how the user will navigate the sub-content within one of the nodes, and we had defined these sliding interactions from node to node. And if you remember, the vision demo kind of references that a little bit because that's how the user transitions from one area of content to the next. So feeling pretty good about this, we took this to developers and we had a little bit of a roadblock. You see, we learned that designing the site as a rich internet application would actually not be feasible in a lot of time and budget because of the complexity of this task. Essentially, we were proposing to design something like this. Light years ahead of everything goes really awesome, but we really needed to rethink our approach at this point, and so that we could end up with maybe something like this, still really awesome, but realistic at the same time. So if I summarize, what can we do to deliver our experience in the most exciting way possible and still meet all of our goals? And we realized that the hybrid approach would be the best way to go about this. By hybrid approach, I mean that we'll use HTML for pages with static content, and we'll save the Silverlight pieces for areas where we really need to deliver a very rich internet experience. And for users who cannot access the Silverlight content, we will afford for graceful degradation. Actually, the hybrid approach, the nice thing about that is that we identified this problem fairly early on in our design process, so we really didn't need to rework our information architecture or any of the work that we did previously. And we were able to then move forward with creating the high-level wireframe archetypes. You can see this is sort of like a template that defines where the navigation elements will live, where the content will live, footer, things like that. And moving forward, we then start to refine this and create our wireframes. These are some of the pages from the wireframes document that we delivered to the developers. Here we're trying to be as detailed as possible, trying to outline the functionality in greatest detail. And however, this does not inform the final visual design of the product. Here's some more details. And when you're developing something like this, you want to be presenting this to your team as early as possible so you can kind of get some of that feedback and have a chance to refine this and make adjustments as necessary. But as I mentioned before, this doesn't actually say anything about the final design of the product, how the product will look. This just outlines the features and the functionality. And having approved the wireframes, then we were able to move on to fleshing out the design for the site. Now this is the step where we define how the site will look and define all visual aspects of the user experience. The output of this stage is a set of graphic design mockups or comps that are pixel perfect and will tell everybody exactly what the final experience is going to look like. And when we set out to do this, we really need to think about our intended approach to this design stage. And our intended approach was to craft a visual aesthetic that exemplified the Blue Angels image and invoked an emotional response that one might associate with the Blue Angels experience. And this kind of goes back to the point about extending and augmenting the Blue Angels experience on the web. And to do this, we must first identify the qualities that one might associate with the Blue Angels and then try to represent those qualities in our designs. And so, what are some of those qualities? An example of that may be the Blue Angels image. Perhaps one of the most emblematic things when you're thinking about the Blue Angels. I'm talking here about the Blue Angels logo and the Blue Angels color scheme of blue and gold. So this is pretty easy. We can take the blue and gold and the logo, we'll prominently display this on our website, and we'll make our interface kind of resemble the Blue Angels branding, reference the Blue Angels branding, and adopt those colors. But what are some of the other things? Precision. When you're thinking about how the Blue Angels do their maneuvers, they have to be very precise because their lives depend on them being very precise. It's integral to everything that they do. And we wanted to convey this in our designs, and there are certain ways that we can do this. So when we're creating our elements, graphic elements, we can use a lot of geometric shapes, for example, sharp edges, and really try to maybe avoid excessively ornate detail. That should convey a good sense of precision. Order and discipline are pretty much the cornerstones of any military organization. And we can reference that through the way that we number our lists, for example, our choice of typography, so using a nice kind of strict sans serif font in our designs. Also using grids for our page layouts. and dynamism. So when you're thinking about the Blue Angels, or when you visit one of their demonstrations, those guys fly really fast jets. Their shows are very dynamic. They actually do use explosions during the final demonstrations. And we can convey some of those qualities through things like UI transitions, the imagery that we use, and also using aircraft references. So this is the final product of this design stage, and you can see that the design is really starting to take shape. Here we can see that we're using a lot of the blue and gold that I mentioned before. We're displaying the logo very prominently. I'm not sure if you can see some of the finer details, but we're actually using like aircraft rivets in the header, a lot of geometric shapes, and a very strict grid layout throughout as well, so to convey some of that sense of precision and order. What you actually don't see from that is some of the dynamic qualities that I mentioned, but I'll reference that later. And that design went through several iterations, and when everybody was happy with it, we were then able to start the development of the interface, and the designers actually play a pretty big role in that because we help with the asset production for the site. And by that I mean we help to export the little pieces and that will form the user interface. And you know, as I mentioned before, we took the hybrid approach, so that means we have both HTML parts and serverless parts to this website. And this presents a certain challenge, mostly because we have to produce 2 times the number of assets. We need to produce the vector assets for the Silverlight approach and the PNGs or JPEGs for our HTML approach. And this is something that we actually accounted for because this does take more time than just producing graphics for the Silverlight or just the HTML. And the HTML asset production was a pretty straightforward process, and I should mention that it's very helpful to have somebody who is knowledgeable in HTML development and has a good handle on some of these graphics applications that we use, because this person can create the CSS and the styling for the layouts and also export the graphics in the right format and the right size and knows things about compressions and things like that, so it streamlines the process a lot. Essentially what we're doing here is we're taking our designs and we're breaking them out into individual pieces that will then get put together during this HTML development stage. The production of the Silverlight assets was a little bit more tricky because we had decided to keep the UI vector-based for the most part. And we do this to decrease the size of the download and to help improve performance and image quality with things like scaling and animation. And the challenge here really revolved around some of the cross-compatibility issues that we had between Adobe software, which we use to design our user interfaces, and the Blend software that we will use to build the user interfaces. We basically designed the UIs in Illustrator, and the Blend doesn't play very well with that format because of the way things are grouped and layers and some of the advanced attributes of images such as transparency. So how do we solve that challenge? Well, first off, we had enough foresight to realize that this was actually going to be a problem, and we had enough time dedicated to figuring out what was the best approach, how we should structure our accounts, and how we should prepare our assets. And this allowed us to then create assets in such a way that most of them were imported into Blend without a problem. And those that we could not import into Blend, we just recreated an expression design or expression blend. And there was a very small fraction of that, actually. Another interesting challenge is conveying some of the UI's dynamic qualities to the developers, because developers build a lot of these interfaces, but we have spec'd out that we wanted this interface to be dynamic, as you can remember. And this is not something that we can show in static comps, so how do we convey some of those dynamic qualities to the developers? And to solve this problem, we created several small kind of motion prototypes and vignettes that we were then able to show and convey the sense of timing and motion that we wanted to recreate throughout our user interface. And I have a small video here to show that. Basically, there we go. This is a small kind of vignette that you saw that showed some of the transition elements of a navigation element. And what we're trying to see there is the keyframing, some of the motion qualities, how fast the things transition, kind of what is the end state, what is the sequence of that transition, what are some of the other animation properties, such as timing. And we created several of these and then we handed them off to developers so that they can look at those qualities and then begin to create some of the other similar elements for the design. The last step in our kind of design journey is the design quality assurance. And this is not something that always gets done on a project, because this is usually something that happens at the end of a project and there's little time and budget to devote to this. But I want to encourage you guys to put some time aside for the design quality assurance, because I'm confident that your project, as our project did, could also benefit from something like this. What I'm talking here is basically involving the designers in looking at the website or the product that you're developing at some point during the alpha or beta stages and providing their feedback. Our project benefited from this because we were able to identify some of the areas for improvement, such as the video player and the background for the site, that we were then able to go and redesign. We had ample time for this because we were able to get to this stage early on. And there's a few things that you might want to consider when you want your designers to help you improve your products. And some of the things like allowing ample time for user experience testing and revisions. This takes time, so we really need to sit down with the product and kind of walk through it and experience it for ourselves and provide suggestions. And if you give us access early, we can do a better job because this will allow for more revisions. We were pretty lucky on this project because our developers were able to set up a test server, internal test server that we had access to, and we were able to go in there and test the site and identify any key areas that needed improvement. It's small things that you might not see, like fonts, but we have a keen eye for that, and we will mention that to you. Also, discuss the implications of proposed changes. We can, as designers, we're trying to create the most impactful user experience, and we can really propose the sky here. Of course, that's not always realistic, so it's really helpful for the developers and the designers to get in the same room and kind of discuss what the impact of those changes are on the overall project and budget, if it's something that's feasible, because maybe a compromise is a good solution. And we did this for our project, and that helped us to kind of refine the user experience in the end and come out with something that we're pretty happy with. This actually concludes my portion of the presentation.